Well, it's a pleasure to speak to you. And the times make it um, a pretty good time for us to have this discussion. So I don't know where to start. One second you've got drones in Poland, next second you've got a strike in Qatar, and then you've got the incursion to Gaza City. Then you've got the drills that are happening in Poland and in Belarus. There's a lot going on. So maybe let's start maybe with the latest event, just something I'm still trying to figure out, the drone incursion into Poland. When I first heard about it, when the team woke me up, I assumed it's the same thing that happened a few years ago during the G20 summit. Everyone was up in arms. NATO's going to respond. Article 5 is going to be invoked. And then later we found out it's I think, it's a Ukrainian the anti-missile defense system. Now, this one seems a bit different, Alexander. It's 20 drones, 15 to 20 drones, and they seem to have been intentionally fired towards Poland for whatever reason, whether it's political posturing, whether it's to test NATO's resolve, unless you disagree it was even intentional. So maybe give us your analysis of that incursion.
It might have been intentional, but I find it difficult to understand why, because the drones in question were decoy drones. They didn't carry explosives. They entered into Polish airspace. They went further in, but they were never likely to do very much damage. And it seems to me that if the Russians, and these were, to be clear about these are definitely Russian drones. I mean, there's no question about that. And I think a key thing to say is that the Russians are not denying that these were Russian drones. If there had been an intention to send some very strong message, I can't help but think that something rather more forceful would have been attempted. So it seems to me there are a number of possibilities. Possibility one is that there was a massive drone strike conducted by the Russians just across the border in western Ukraine itself. The drones and missiles pummeled the West Ukrainian city of Lvov and did significant damage there. These were decoy drones. They might have been part of that strike. The Ukrainians perhaps failed to shoot them down. They then drifted on. They crossed the frontier. They are not targeting a particular location. So unless they're shot down, they would fly on, and they might have flown on into Poland, and perhaps the wind conditions took them. The alternative is what the Belarusians are saying, that they were diverted from their course by electronic warfare. Now, these are theories. We don't know what the truth is. The Russians, interestingly, have not denied that they are drones, that they are their own drones. They said to the Poles, let's have a meeting between our military people and your military people. Let's discuss what happened. We don't quite understand how this could have happened because, to the best of our knowledge, these drones have a shorter range and they shouldn't have got into your country at all. But we're not saying, that they didn't. We're not saying that this isn't true. Let's have a talk and sit down and work out together what it was that took place. Now, again, the Russians doing that, it doesn't seem to me like a threat or a warning, because would you really want to sit down with the Poles to discuss it in that kind of way if it was anything other than, as I said, an unintended thing? 20 drones seems like a lot, but hundreds of drones, at least 400 drones, were launched against this attack on Western Ukraine. Wow. And I mean, the 400, apparently 40 cruise missiles. That is the scale of the war we're looking at. But I want to stress, these are theories. I don't really know exactly what happened.
Have you seen the reports? I'm not sure what the source is, that the drones had an additional fuel tank that would not be necessary if they were striking Western Ukraine. Do you know what the source of these reports are, and does that mean anything?
Well, no. Well, first of all, it might not mean very much, and it might be that this information is wrong, and I haven't actually been able to verify that information myself. But, Russia's a huge place. Lots of things that happened there. It may be that one part of the Russian military, I know this sounds unusual, one part of the Russian military may be doing one thing, somebody else, saying the intelligence agencies, might be doing something quite different. I suspect that if it was intentional. It was not intended to act as a warning exactly. It might have been more intended to see how strong the
Mm.
actual air defenses in Poland really are, because there's been all this talk recently about deploying European troops to Western Ukraine, and the Russians might want to get a sense of how strong NATO's defenses on their eastern
That was
flanks
my
are.
assumption. That was my assumption
Yeah,
because,
yeah.
and from what I've read, it wasn't that impressive. They needed to deploy F-13s to be able to shoot down the drones, and they only shot down a handful of them. Is that correct?
Yeah, absolutely. It is all over the media here in London that this was a failure. It was a debacle, and that is concerning because clearly, if they can't shoot down simple decoy drones, how exactly do you
They're
deal
not
with?
ready. It seems they're not
No,
ready
they're
for the
not
new
ready.
warfare that we're
No,
facing now.
no,
Like
no,
I think
not at
they're
all.
all set up for the old wars, the old type of wars from a couple of decades ago, but not the drone warfare that we're seeing now. They haven't
No,
really
then
caught up.
no. That is exactly right. And by the way, I mean, I have to add this. I mean, obviously, the Ukrainians have far more experience in
Mm.
shooting down drones than anyone in the West does. But the fact that Poland had so much trouble shooting these drones down must call into some question some of the Ukrainian claims that they're shooting down 95% of the drones that are launched against them. Again, this is an inference. I don't know this for a fact, but I think it's a reasonable one, given the damage that these drone offensives that we know about are actually doing.
Hmm. Now, in that same week, we have the drills, the Zapad 2025. Now, these drills
Mm.
have happened since I think early 2000s, 2008, I think, and they were, the concerning thing there. And first, I think it's a nothing burger. I had a discussion with Colonel Mercouri yesterday. He also thought it's nothing to be concerned about, but there are some people that are worried, and rightly so. First, you've got the Oreshnik missile that's being tested there in those drills. You've also, there's an interesting fact that those drills were a pretext to the invasion in 2022. A few months beforehand, those massive drills with 300,000, which is about 10 to 15 times more than the drills that are happening at the moment as we speak.
Yeah.
And there were smaller drills prior to the invasion as well. But if we add this piece of news, you add the drone incursion in Poland, the biggest yet, in Poland invoking Article 4. And lastly, you've also got a nuclear-capable missile allegedly deployed in Kaliningrad by Russia on the Polish border. Now, that's again happened before. I think 2018 was the last time. But if you put all these things in 1 week, and not long after the negotiations between Putin and Trump, two questions. First, should we start looking into it a bit further that maybe Russia has other intentions? I don't think so, but is it possible to steel man that argument? And second question is, why? Why now? I thought we're going to be heading in the
Well,
direction of peace talks.
well, I think you make absolutely correct points. I don't think this is a nothing burger. I don't think Zapad 25 is a nothing burger. I don't
Hmm.
think it is being prepared in order to mount another offensive on Kiev, though one should not exclude completely that possibility. As you correctly said, the exercises that took place in Belarus in the autumn and winter of 2021, 2022 did provide cover for the attack on Kiev then. But I don't think this is the case today. But tensions in Europe are extremely high. We've had the Oreshnik deployed to Belarus. The first one, apparently, has been deployed to Belarus. You're absolutely correct. The Russians are ramping up their forces in Kaliningrad. They are worried, obviously. I mean, this is what it looks to me. Just as we are worried about our eastern flank, they are worried about their western flank. They're hearing all these reports from the West about troop deployments in Western Ukraine, the coalition of the willing, and all of that. And I have to say, to me, it looks like they're taking first precautions.
Can you explain to the audience what's so significant about the Oreshnik ballistic missile, the maneuvering capabilities? I know the only time we've seen it in action was, I think in Dnipro, that warning strike.
We don't know a huge amount about it, and I think this is another thing to say. There's been lots of people who, Professor Postol, who, by the way, I slightly know, and others have come up with all sorts of ideas about this. But the one thing we know is that it is a very, very powerful, very, very long-range missile with undoubted hypersonic speed. I mean, high hypersonic speed. I mean, around 10 times the speed of sound, and that its warheads also move at multiple times the speed of sound, and that there is no weapon in existence at the present time anywhere that is capable of intercepting it. So it is a very powerful weapon with a very long
Alexander, sorry,
range.
can I interrupt you?
Yes.
Alexander, can I interrupt you? Can you check your sources? I'm just getting reports as we speak. I'm sorry to interrupt you. That there is residents of the bordering regions of Romania and Poland have received alerts on their mobile phones warning them of an imminent air attack by Russia. This according to the Pakistan News. Sirens are now being sounded in eastern Poland and fighter jets have been scrambled. The message in Polish translates to attention, threat of an air attack. Exercise extreme caution, follow the instruction of the authorities, await further communications. How is that something that just happens on a regular basis with
It
drones going
happens.
loose from the war? Okay.
It does happen. So I mean, I wouldn't worry too much about this at the moment. But again, it's another sign of how tense the whole situation altogether currently is. I mean, I wouldn't worry about alerts of this kind, but the presence of the Oreshnik in Belarus,
Yeah,
the
can you
size
continue on
of
that
these things.
discussion that I
Yeah,
interrupted? Yeah,
yeah,
please. Sandra,
exactly.
go ahead.
Exactly. I mean, the deployment of these kind of weapons, the deployment of nuclear weapons in Kaliningrad, does, taken together, it is worrying. And with the Oreshnik, it can hit targets anywhere in continental Europe, including Britain. And there are no air defenses, no successful, effective air defenses against it.
That's a pretty big statement. There's no successful air defense system
No.
against the Oreshnik.
No, there is none. I mean, there is no air defense system in existence today. I mean, there might be eventually, but there is no air defense system that exists today that can intercept an Oreshnik missile. I mean, it moves too fast, it maneuvers too much, and
That's crazy.
it's well, it is an extraordinary weapon. It is a capability that I think has been in existence for a while, but up to now nobody has wanted to deploy because it is destabilizing. And well, we can see that the Russians have now deployed it.
Just 3 hours ago as well, the NATO chief said the following: Russian missiles can hit London or Madrid in minutes. Why do you think he's saying that? Is that just kind of to kind of keep that fear ongoing on why we need to keep supporting Ukraine?
Well, he's saying it because, of course, it's factually true. They can hit London or Madrid in minutes. I mean, the Oreshnik does have that range. Nuclear weapons, of course, nuclear missiles can do the same. But the reason he's saying it is because we are in a period of extreme tension, and he is highlighting that. He's highlighting these things, and we have a very tense situation. European Western states, NATO states, are talking continuously about the threat to them from Russia. And the Russians, for their part, are worried about the threat to themselves from NATO and about these talks about coalition troops, Western coalition troops entering Ukraine.
Does that worry? Is that a worry that we should even be thinking about right now? Because I can't remember who I was talking to yesterday, and I just feel like we're like a boiling frog, just heading towards a more and more dangerous world. Israel striking Qatar, the war in Gaza, Israel striking multiple countries all at once in 1 week or 24 hours. I mean, Yemen, Syria, Lebanon, a few months ago, Iran, off the coast of Tunisia, obviously Gaza and Qatar. And then we've got the war in Ukraine that's ongoing, and now it's become part of normal life. And peace negotiations are not moving forward. So
No.
a few years ago, the talk of a nuclear war between the West, between NATO and Russia was, people were saying, analysts saying 50-50 chance of a nuclear war, etc. Is that still the case today, or have things eased up now under Trump?
No, I think we are dangerously complacent about this. And I would add something else, which is that the one important arms control treaty that is left, which is the START treaty, the Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty, that was agreed by Obama and the Russians back in the late 2000s, that is due to expire in February, and there are no negotiations to extend it. And without the treaty being extended, and there's no talk of it at the moment, we will have no arms controls, no nuclear arms control at all. So I think this is a very, very dangerous moment indeed. And it is absolutely one that requires diplomatic action. And going back to your earlier question, just a few weeks ago, we had a meeting in Alaska between Putin and Trump. It did seem that things were moving in the right direction, finally, towards some kind of negotiation. The Russians yesterday were saying that all the negotiations are currently on pause. There has been no progress made. We can debate, no doubt we will debate, who is responsible for that. But instead of moving forward with negotiations, we are in this very tense situation that we're in at the moment, where there are air raid alerts, worries about drones, continued fighting in Ukraine, even as the situation everywhere else in the world is deteriorating almost at the same time in exactly the way that you said.
Yeah, just for people listening, like I was in Kiev a few months ago. Almost every day there's sirens. Like you see sirens outside. You get on the app, and sometimes every few days you see the shooting. Like this is just daily life now in Kiev. Um, but why do you think the negotiations are on hold? What happened since Alaska? Because I was really optimistic afterwards.
Well, I was optimistic, but I always had one important concern, which is it seemed to me that meeting in Alaska had been asked for by Trump and arranged in far too much of a hurry. So each leader went to that meeting with their own ideas about the way forward and without really understanding very well the opinions of the others. So Trump went to the meeting and apparently came out of the meeting assuming that the Russians had agreed to security guarantees of a Western style for Ukraine, deployments of NATO peacekeepers in Western Ukraine, freezes of the conflicts to Ukrainian regions, and a trilateral meeting with between Putin, Zelensky, and Trump. It was obvious to me at the time that the Russians had no idea of conceding any of those things. And I think that the Americans misread certain Russian messages that, yes, they were prepared to talk about these subjects, but the Americans thought that the Russians were more willing to agree to them than they really were. And on the Russian side, they came from the meeting, they went to the meeting, and they came from the meeting clearly assuming that the Americans were prepared to enter into these discussions to rethink the entire security architecture in Europe. And again, I never imagined for a moment that the Americans had agreed to any such thing either. So the two leaders left the meeting, and over the next couple of days and weeks, they discovered that they'd made actually very little progress indeed. And of course, that has caused disappointment and anger on both sides. And it is leading to the deterioration which we are seeing now.
Before continuing on the peace negotiations and why we are where we are and what could happen next, what a peace deal could even look like, I want to take a step back on something you mentioned earlier when we're talking about the drills that are happening right now in Belarus. So, the Zapad drills happened months before the invasion. Now, you're saying there's a possibility that those drills could be a preparation for Russia, even though it's potentially below 50% likelihood, but it is still a significant likelihood that should be taken seriously, that it is a pretext to invade for a new offensive towards Kiev, to capture Kiev.
Well, I don't think so, but I wouldn't exclude it. I mean, this is unfortunately where we are today, because we saw that happen before, and it would be a mistake to think that it cannot happen again today. I mean, the Russians are already involved in a war in Ukraine. They are fighting in 1,200 kilometer front line right across Ukraine at the moment. Um, the Ukrainians are said to be very overextended. They've suffered very heavy losses. You could argue that from a Russian point of view, this is a good moment to attack Kiev because the Ukrainians are so short of men that they might not be able to defend it. Now, I want to stress I don't have any information that that is the case. On the contrary, I don't believe it is the case. But if I was a Ukrainian planner or a NATO planner, I could not discount the possibility. And from the Russian side, they must be looking at deployments in Poland and the rhetoric in the West about sending troops to Western Ukraine. Macron talking about 20 to 30,000 men being sent to Western Ukraine. And again, the Russians probably telling themselves this isn't really going to happen. But how can we be sure? How can we be absolutely sure that things like this might not happen? And you can imagine that they would take precautions to prepare for that possibility. It is exactly the scenario that can lead to a clash without anybody actually willing one.
Can you explain how that scenario would unfold? So what, France would send troops, or the coalition would send troops to Western Ukraine as a peacekeeping force, and what would Russia do? Accidentally strike them?
Well, no. I mean, what would happen? I mean, to give a very simple example, British and French troops are deployed to eastern Poland, apparently preparatory to moving into Ukraine. There might be no intention, actually, to move them into Ukraine. They might be there just to be held in readiness for something. The Russians would see them there. They'd said the NATO is about to enter Poland, to enter Ukraine from Poland. And before they enter Ukraine, they are targets. And in anticipation of their entering Ukraine, we should strike them, because when they enter Ukraine itself, they might disperse. They might have all kinds of opportunities to gain air defenses. We've got to cut this in the bud. So yeah, I can imagine those scenarios.
That's
they
scary.
are not impossible. They're not. Well, absolutely. And in the Cold War, during the Cold War, along the east, the inner German border, the area, Berlin and all around, these kind of scenarios were playing out continuously. And both superpowers eventually became very concerned about them. And then in the 1960s and 1970s, we had a whole set of agreements to create what were called confidence building measures. So each side needed to alert the other when their forces were moving around. And that did play a very big role in securing peace and in stabilizing the atmosphere in Europe. We have nothing like that today. Everybody's trying to second guess what the other side is doing. Neither side trusts the other. I cannot imagine a more dangerous situation than this.
What do you make of the developments in Belarus? Look, I've always seen Lukashenko. I've interviewed him about a year ago, and I've always seen him as someone that's trying to be kind of the peacekeeper between the bridge between Russia and the West. He likes Trump. He spoke very positively of Trump, and obviously he's a friend of Putin. What do you think of him releasing those hostages and Trump saying he would like to open the U.S. embassy, reopen the embassy in Belarus?
Well, I think this is a good sign. And I think Lukashenko actually has provided a back channel between the Americans and the Russians. And he has apparently advised the Americans on the correct way to speak with the Russians. And if we have a situation where there are direct air links between Belarus and the United States, which it seems there are, then that opens the way, that opens the door for Russian travelers who want to travel to the United States to go to Minsk, board an American airline, and travel directly to the United States. So I would say this is a very positive thing. So we get the positive together with the negative. It is what makes it so very difficult to understand exactly what is going on and to get a clear sense of the direction. But the fact that Lukashenko has met an American delegation, that meeting went well, that these agreements were made, as I said, that is a big step forward and one to build on. The Europeans, by the way, don't seem to be pleased about it at all, which is something I, as a European, I simply cannot understand.
Yeah, neither can I. Um, I like, one thing I found with President Lukashenko, he does want that normalization with Europe. He doesn't see the US as an enemy. He didn't talk about them as an enemy. The West talks about Belarus as like this big evil country. Lukashenko is this big evil man. You could be critical of the elections. You could be critical of how he runs his country. That's your right to do so.
Yeah.
But turning the country, you could be critical of. There's other countries that are allied to the West that are, one could argue, even worse than Belarus. But moving aside from that, it's politics 101. What about Trump's comments? He said, I think 2 days ago, he asked if his patience with Putin had run out. He said, yeah, it's sort of running out and running out fast. We're going to have to come down very strong.
Well,
Is that just him
again,
frustrated that he's not
well,
reaching the progress he's looking for?
well, again, of course, he said this before. And with Trump, you can never be completely sure because he's done this many times. One day, he is losing patience with Putin and beginning to become very angry. The next moment, Putin and he can have a very happy and good meeting or conversation. It's on and off, and it's very, very bewildering. The problem is, and this is the risk, because this has happened so many times, the Russians are no longer paying attention. They no longer listen to what Trump is saying. And the risk is that eventually his patience will run out and he will do something. And that, because it's in a kind of way unexpected, might intensify tensions even more. My own guess is that Trump is disappointed with the outcome of the meeting in Alaska. I think the Russians are disappointed with the outcome of the meeting in Alaska. I think both Putin and Trump went to that meeting with expectations, which, as I discussed, were based on wrong assumptions about the other. And they both come away disappointed. In Trump's case, he has difficulties containing himself. And of course, he's also under considerable pressure in the United States and from the Europeans to escalate sanctions against the Russians. So there is a degree of disappointment. There's a degree of maneuvering as well on Trump's side. But sooner or later, somebody inevitably is going to want to hold Trump to his words. And that then we could find ourselves in an even more dangerous situation than the one we're in today.
And what do you make of Putin and Modi's visit to China and Putin staying for that military parade with Kim Jong-un and others, including representatives from Iran? So first, how important is it? How significant is it? And second, what do you think of that military parade and the military equipment that were demonstrated by China? Some analysts were pretty surprised by how fast they're
Well,
progressing.
Well, indeed, absolutely. Well, first of all, I think that was a meeting that Putin had to go to. I mean, China is Russia's strategic partner. Xi Jinping had been to Russia in May to attend the Victory Day parade there. Putin could not stay away from the military parade in Beijing. And I mean, there was no way that he would want to stay away, and he clearly didn't. As for the preceding meeting, which took place in Tianjin, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization meeting, the one which Modi attended, I think it's both important, but it's also important not to get into not to overstate the significance of it. Pakistan, by the way, also attended that meeting. I mean, they were also there. Pakistan continues to have a
That's
very
interesting.
strong, continues to have a very strong relationship with China too. China and India are BRICS partners. The Indians obviously are very annoyed with the pressure that the Americans have been exerting against them. So this is a good moment for them to want to improve their relations with China. I want to see relations between India and China improve because, as far as I'm concerned, it is objectively a good thing. But it is a very long process. There will probably also be all sorts of zigzags and problems along the way. and we should see the meeting in Tianjin as a step in that direction rather than the end point of it.
But how do you interpret that visit by Modi? I know Pakistan was there, but if you compare that with the tariffs and also the vibe that we saw at that meeting, they met like they're best friends. You don't see Modi with Putin. That I know they do have that friendship, but not the same way as we've seen with him, Putin, and Xi Jinping. Very, very symbolic. And the military parade. I want you to talk about the military equipment that were demonstrated as well. The nuclear capable ICBMs, the unmanned underwater vehicles, the hypersonic anti-ship missiles. The list goes on. The laser defense systems as well. But they didn't have a lot of people are talking the rumors about the H-20 as a rival to the B-2. That wasn't there, thankfully, but no one really expected it to be there. I'd love to get your thoughts on that. It's kind of the chemistry between them, and whether the US should be worried about that new multipolar world that's happening under our feet. And secondly, back to the question about the military equipment by China.
Yeah, I mean, the chemistry actually is important. And of course, Modi has now invited Putin to come to India in December.
That's a bit of a screw you to Trump, isn't it?
Well, it is.
That's going to piss off Trump.
I mean, it was being talked about before, but of course now bringing it, confirming it in that way is almost calculated, as you rightly say, to annoy the Americans. Now, I think this is partly what happened. Modi, I think, is generally very angry with Trump. I mean, he thought that he had a good relationship with Trump. The Americans had encouraged India to buy oil from Russia.
Yeah,
this is no longer.
Most people don't know that.
Most
people don't know that the US under Biden encouraged India to buy Russian oil to keep prices low,
exactly.
and then what we have now is. But why go to tariffs? Do you think Trump asked Modi to stop buying the oil prior to that, and Modi refused, or Biden even before that later on in the administration?
Well, I mean, undoubtedly, the Americans have been signaling for some time that they want India to stop buying Russian oil. They also want India to stop buying Russian weapons. They want India ultimately to leave the BRICS. They're making one demand of the Indians after the other. And I don't think that the Indians are prepared to do any of those things, because as far as they're concerned, doing those things would signal that India is not a strong country. It is not a rising country which is going to one day become a great power. India values its independence. It values its policies of non-alignment. I think Modi felt very angry and very betrayed, and doesn't want the Americans to be coming along and basically dictating who India trades with and does business with. So I think the Indians were furious. And I think Modi personally was furious. So he goes off to China, and well, now he is with friends. I mean, this is the sort of rebound, if you like, from the obvious anger he feels with Trump. And apparently, according to the American media, he's already also refused multiple attempts by Trump to call him. Now, I think this will be sorted out. I think there's been claims.
I didn't know about these reports.
Absolutely, yeah. I think it was political.
Is that possible? You think that's possible?
Well, the Americans are saying it. I mean, I haven't seen any Indian denials, and it would be likely true. But apparently, Trump has attempted on 4 occasions to call Modi.
Oh, wow.
And Modi apparently, wasn't.
It's funny. It's funny that those people that dictate where our world is heading kind of fall into the same traps as us humans fall into. Like your friend sends something that upsets you, and then he stopped taking your calls for a few days. It's like we're seeing the same thing now when it comes to geopolitical giants.
Well, they're people. They're people.
They are.
So I mean,
they are.
It shouldn't surprise us.
When you say people, I want to link this to a comment that Putin made many years ago. And it's a bit, digressing a bit from the discussion, but linking to how these things happen behind the scenes. He did make a statement that I'm sure you've heard. It's like, I make a deal with the president, and then men in black suits come and everything changes, or we discuss something completely new. So essentially what he's implying is that, the president changes every 4 to 8 years, and they're not the ones that make all the decisions. There are things happening behind the scenes that that either happening without the president's knowledge or without the president being able to directly control those outcomes. What do you make of that theory, that there is that military-industrial complex that is always rolling, and then they look at presidents as temporary CEOs that come and go? And then how do you kind of compare that to what you've just said now? Is that these are people making decisions. They call each other. Like, how significant are these calls? How significant is Trump's policy towards India and what Trump tells Modi? And even the peace negotiations between Trump and Putin, how significant are those when Putin knows in 3 years, he just has to wait 3 years and a whole new administration will take over,
Yes.
potentially?
Yeah, one should not underestimate the power of the President of the United States within the American system. And the same applies to all of the other leaders. I mean, if Modi wants to do something, then generally it gets done. I mean, there are obviously political and legal and other constraints, but provided they're acting within their inherent powers, then they could do it. And if Trump really wanted to change policy decisively, he could change policy. So there is a permanent government in the United States. There's a permanent bureaucracy. There are people within the defense industries. There are people in the Pentagon. There are people in the intelligence services. They have their own views. Sometimes they're in conflict with the presidents. And obviously, there's always a negotiation that has to be done between the president and his officials as to what the policy would be. But undoubtedly, the president does play a role. The problem is that this particular president has great difficulty, I think, having a consistent policy. He has views one day, which he changes the next. He doesn't prepare properly for meetings. And I don't think he properly thinks and works these things through. And he himself shows on occasions moments of great petulance and anger and frustration, which unfortunately distort his policies and what he wants to do. Now, if we're talking about the people in the permanent bureaucracy, I mean, one must always remember something else about them. I mean, they obviously are there all the time, and they are observing the changes in the world, and the world is changing. And that brings me back to your question about the military display that took place in Beijing, because China, has for some time now been roughly America's coeval in economic power. And of course, in manufacturing power, it is America's superior. What the parade showed is that China is rapidly catching up with the United States as a military power as well. And that is going to be very unsettling in Washington, given, of course, the long history that the Americans have of assuming that they are the major military power. So there will be lots of discussions, lots of arguments about what to do. This is one reason why, according to some reports, the Americans were very shocked by that picture of Modi, Putin, and Xi. Not so much what the three said, but the fact that they were there, that they were meeting with Xi Jinping, that they were at the other great center of power, and there will be tensions between those who say we need to take forward steps, offensive steps, because we need to secure Taiwan and the various island chains and do all of that. And then there will be others who will say, no, we've got to retreat, we've got to defend the Western Hemisphere, and we've got to start opening proper discussions with the other side, because this is in danger of getting under control. So that, I think, is the significance of the parade. Carry on.
Yeah, JD Vance did early on in the administration. He did mention, that we live in a multipolar world from memory. I can't remember exactly what he said. So I think it seems that this administration understands that it is no longer American hegemony, despite Trump's rhetoric in America first, we are the best. I think behind the scenes they understand that China and India, to an extent, Russia has proven itself over the last 3 years to be other superpowers. As you said, the Oreshnik could strike Europe within minutes. How long would it take to strike? Could it reach the US, and how long would it take to reach?
No, it doesn't have the range. It does well. Actually, there's some people in Russia who say that it can, but it would have to be launched from the Russian Far East, and it would only be able to reach certain targets in the northwest coast of the United States. It is not a missile with that kind of range that it can hit any target in the world.
It's a medium range
It's
missile.
a medium-range missile system. Of course, the Russians have other systems which have a much longer range than that, but that's the limitation that the Oreshnik does have. But you're absolutely right. I mean, the Americans have been used for a very long time to thinking of themselves as, you know, the hyperpower. They intellectually, or at least some Americans now intellectually understand that that is no longer the case, that they are in a world of several great powers. J.D. Vance said it. Marco Rubio, the US Secretary of State, also said it. In fact, you can find his comments on the State Department's website. They're still there. They can see that China is rapidly becoming a superpower. Russia, obviously less powerful, significantly less powerful, but nevertheless a major force to be reckoned with, and a nuclear superpower. India, a rising superpower.
Yeah,
So
India's got so
suddenly,
much potential. So much
absolutely,
potential.
absolutely. I mean, I don't think anybody who studies the trends in world affairs seriously questions that in 20 years' time, definitely, perhaps even 10 years' time, India will have taken its place as another superpower. So where you were once the sole hyperpower, you are now working inside a system where there are 3 and perhaps 4. So that is going to be very unsettling to you, and you have to try and work out what you do. And you can see that people within the permanent government of the United States, the bureaucracy in the Pentagon, the bureaucracies in the State Department, who are used to the other world, are going to find it very difficult to break with old habits and to embrace new thinking and to take a country like India seriously. One of the other things I spoke about, the anger that Modi feels, one should not underestimate the anger that the Americans also feel. It has been a shock to them that India pushed back. I mean, it was not what they expected at all. And they told themselves also that India would never, ever get onto good terms with China. Impossible that will ever happen. Just as they used to say to themselves that the Russians and the Chinese will never find a way together either. And suddenly they see all these pictures of Modi and Xi Jinping looking very happy and friendly with each other. And they've seen the parade and they're aware of the realities of the economics, and they're aware of China's mastery of rare earths, and they know that the Chinese are moving forward with chips and AI technology and all of that. And you can understand that there is anger and there's panic and there's fear, and they're asking themselves, what is India really going to do?
Yeah, well, you could argue that the US did this to itself. You know, it could have prevented, in my opinion, it could have prevented the war in Ukraine without NATO's expansion, and that, you know, then it would have led to better relations with India,
Well, indeed,
and then it would have been
absolutely.
a very different world.
Well, you have actually put your finger on the single most important thing that needs to be done in Europe in order to ease tensions there. And that is to simply say, and this isn't just the United States, NATO and all the various NATO states should simply say, Ukraine's membership of NATO is off the table. It's not going to
But
happen.
hasn't Trump already said this?
Yes, he said this, but he's at the same time talking about security guarantees, which the Russians see as NATO stealth, and introducing European peacekeepers into NATO, and the other European members of NATO, Britain, France, and Germany, continue to insist, and this is public official policy, they've continued to insist in their statements. Britain concluded a treaty just a few months ago with Ukraine, in which they continued to say Ukraine is on an irreversible path towards NATO. So the Russians.
But do you think this is But do you think it's a negotiating tactic? Like, I just think, look, and don't you also agree that Ukraine does need some sort of security guarantees? You can't,
Yes.
demilitarize Ukraine. You can't take up 20% of their territory, and then not even provide them security guarantees, especially after they've just been invaded a few years ago.
Yeah, the problem is that the Russians probably do not see it as a negotiating tactic. What they probably say to themselves is, look, Trump is giving us all these promises, but they're only verbal. There's not going to be a treaty because the Senate will never ratify it. The Europeans don't agree. So if the Europeans don't agree, and if they're still talking about NATO membership, then it looks as if nothing has really changed, because as soon as Trump goes, the next president can reverse the policy, like the Americans reversed policy with Iran, for example, over the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the nuclear agreement that Iran made, like the Americans previously reversed policies over NATO expansion. We will be back exactly where we were, where we started. And that is the argument that exists today in Moscow. Bear in mind that there is no trust now. So you have to all agree that you take the subject of NATO off the table. Now, when you do that, other possibilities open up. The Russians have said that they accept that Ukraine does require security guarantees. They're very, very cautious about saying what that means. And obviously, they will want to ensure that those security guarantees are as watered down as possible. But in a negotiation, things can change. If there is an agreement, finally, that we're not going to move towards Ukraine entering NATO, and that there are not going to be ballistic missiles or anything like that in NATO, in Ukraine, from NATO in Ukraine. Once the Russians are sure that that won't happen, then I think we generally start to see the negotiations open up. So I don't think it's as a negotiating tactic. It's a bad one, if that is what the British and the French and the Germans and all of those think it is. It's a bad one because instead of making negotiations easier, it prevents them from taking place at all.
Yeah, and look, it's just ironic when they make the argument, that people make the argument that Russia's being very unfair in requesting Ukraine to not join NATO or not have ballistic missiles in Ukraine, or any NATO anti-air defense systems even. But then what you're seeing now in Venezuela and the US having the warship there, and seemingly wanting a regime change with the Monroe Doctrine. This is a very interesting dichotomy. But just going back to the reality that we're going to be facing, a multipolar world that we're already in, to be honest. The last time, just think about it, the last time our planet was in a multipolar world, a nuclear-armed multipolar world, we were on the edge of a nuclear war. We were on the edge of nuclear ballistic missiles being launched. I think there was a geotechnical issue by Russia. So now that we're heading back into that world, it's pretty unsettling to make that comparison, no?
Well, it is extremely so. And if the point is this, firstly, we have to conceptually accept, which we haven't done in the West, that we are indeed in a multipolar world. And then we have to conceptually accept something else, which is that the first priority for a statesman is to preserve peace and to ensure and secure peace. And this can only be done through understandings with the great powers, with China, with India, with Russia, also with other countries which may not be great powers in themselves, but which still have significance in the world, Iran being one example, for example. And that means rediscovering diplomacy. It means changing the approach to international relations and returning to the agenda of the second half of the Cold War, confidence-building measures, arms control, attempts to ease tensions, détente, that kind of thing. If you live in Europe, as I do, I'm in London, we are very, very far from that point yet. I think the Americans, strangely enough, are slightly closer to it.
Well, you've mentioned Iran. It goes to a region that's going through an even crazier time right now this year. What do you make of that 12-day war?
Well,
I spoke to someone from Iran recently, and he said that the war hasn't ended. A lot of analysts, I think 60% of analysts, expect the war to continue later this year. Would love to get your stance on this.
Well, I'm one of those analysts. I think we got ourselves a temporary truce in June, but every indication that I am seeing is that we're heading towards a resumption fairly soon, probably before the end of the year, because none of the issues between Iran and the West and Iran and Israel have been resolved. And again, we had resolved, this is what's so frustrating about it. We had resolved those issues with the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action. I was a supporter of the JCPOA.
JCPOA.
I mean, it did provide for successful and acceptable limits on Iran's nuclear enrichment program. And Iran has a right to a nuclear enrichment program. It has a right to civilian nuclear energy. It's there in the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. What we have been demanding is that Iran should be stripped of its rights completely under the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. So instead of building on that, the United States walked away from it in 2018. The European powers did nothing and ended up siding with the United States. Israel has pursued a continuous policy of harassment and hostility towards Iran. And of course, it eventually exploded into this attack in June. And the attack was unsuccessful because its purpose was, in my opinion, unquestionably to destroy Iran's leadership, to decapitate its leadership. And that wasn't achieved. And so they've gone back to the drawing board and they're now looking again at ways to do it. I'm sorry if I'm sounding, rather emotional about this, but I do feel that this was a terrible affair and one that has created a crisis in the Middle East, which it looked at one time as if that crisis had been solved.
Yeah, it is heartbreaking. It is very, very heartbreaking. There's a glimmer of hope as well. With the weakening of Iran, it gives hope for Lebanon to have one military within one government. Now, you're basing this on the assumption that Israel will not continue, incursions into Lebanon if Hezbollah disarms. We have the Assad regime gone, giving hope to Syria, even though it's looking very shaky right now, to say the least. Yeah, I think and obviously Iraq is a different story. Yemen's a mess, so we can't comment on these two. But Gaza's the only heartbreaking scenario here. The others give me hope that maybe the result could be something good. We can see, because like the way I look at it, I would love to get your thoughts on this analysis. It's an oversimplification, but if you look at the Middle Eastern countries that have allied with Israel or normalized relations with Israel, and obviously all those are allied with the US, they're all flourishing economically, especially including where I am right now, where I'm based in Dubai. Jordan and Egypt are two of the biggest recipients. If you take out reconstruction efforts in Ukraine, then US aid to Jordan and Egypt is second and third to Israel. So you've got US aiding countries that normalize relations with Israel. Those countries are doing economically well, and then you've got the countries that are allied with the Iranian regime, Yemen, Syria, Iraq, Lebanon. All of them are a mess. So by Israel weakening Iran, they could be. Please do disagree if you do, because I'm not, I'm still very uncertain about this analysis. But they could have done a favor, especially to Lebanon, that has the opportunity to finally kind of break out of this proxy position.
Well, maybe, and I think that may be true with Lebanon, but ultimately, the problems of the Middle East, it seems to me, are not created by Iran. I mean, I understand that Iran has its policies, and I understand that they're controversial. And I can understand fully why many people in the Middle East are very skeptical of Iran. I mean, I should say I'm from Greece. I mean, we've had lots of interactions.
The US has done worse. Libya, Syria, Iraq, Afghanistan, incomparable.
Exactly. Now, your point about countries prospering in the Middle East, if we achieve a peace in the Middle East, a sustained peace in the Middle East, there is every reason to think that the region will prosper. I mean, it has all of the elements there that are needed to make it prosper. The problem is we are not pursuing policies of peace. We are pursuing policies, at least on the Western side, in my opinion, of seeking victory. Victory in terms of the conflicts in the Palestinian territories, where we absolutely support one side, which is Israel, against the Palestinians. And of course, victory over Iran, though we never fully define what we mean by a victory ultimately over Iran, because
I hope
Iran,
it's not a regime
yeah,
change. I hope it's not a regime change.
well, we talk often as if it is regime change, but the history of regime change in the Middle East has been bad, to put it mildly. And I mean, wanting to achieve regime change in Iran without perhaps even understanding Iran very well, I think would create even more crisis and trouble. So again, looking for conflict with Iran, expanding the area of conflict in the Middle East, is delaying that moment when peace and prosperity, and the prosperity that comes with peace, comes to the Middle East. It is not advancing it.
Don't you think Israel's capabilities in that 12-day war, in striking Iran's leadership, destroying their air defense system, having air superiority, um, wouldn't that put Iran in a very difficult place where they feel pressure to accept almost any deal Trump offers them? And Trump wants to be the deal maker. He wants to be the person to bring peace to the region. So, considering those two factors, wouldn't there be a high likelihood that a peace deal is reached between Iran and the West? Like Iran lost its proxies to an extent. You know, Hezbollah didn't even get involved in the 12-day war. The Houthis, their leadership was killed about a week ago. Hamas, they're being struck all the way in Qatar, and no one's doing anything about it. And Syria, Assad's gone. So it's like Iran really doesn't have a choice for any pragmatic person. And I was speaking to a gentleman yesterday. I think it's Mark Dubowitz, who's obviously got a very different position to what we're talking about now. But he's saying, Mario, like he's an expert when it comes to Iran. He's like, Mario, what was it? His quote's like, don't underestimate hard people's mindset, or what hard people would, when people have a hard mindset. Hard people have a hard mindset, and they would not budge, and Iran will not budge from their mindset and anti-Israeli stance. But I look at them as like they're pragmatic people, and if it's better for their country and for their regime's survival to make a peace deal with Trump and give him that credit, why wouldn't they?
But you assume that they would adopt that calculus. I mean, if you're talking about survival of the regime, they might take a completely different approach. They may say to themselves, on the contrary, that the entire legitimacy of our regime is based on us being an Islamic state that stands up for Palestinian rights in the Palestinian territories and for the Shia people across the
True
Middle
point. Good
East.
point.
And if we start to bend, and if we start to show weakness, then on the contrary, the situation might be, we might lose control in Iran itself, because people might start to say, well, why are we putting up with you in that case, because you're doing lots of things which we don't like. So the calculus might be completely different. The trouble is, as far as I can see, this idea of putting pressure on Iran and forcing it into some kind of an agreement is one that is basically the one that we have been applying now for many years, ever since we walked away from the JCPOA, arguably even before that. We've tried multiple sanctions against Iran. We've now attacked Iran. We've done all kinds of things of that kind. It hasn't yet caused the Iranians to break. Maybe at some point it will. But given the risks and given the dangers if it doesn't, is this really on our side a rational policy to pursue?
What do you make of Iran's military capabilities, them and their proxies, versus Israel after the last 2 years? After we saw Israel's pager attack on Hezbollah and the way they've targeted their leadership, after obviously the 12-day war with Iran, their ability to kill the Houthi leadership as well in Yemen. First, does that surprise you? And second, what do you make of the of the entire balance of power in the Middle East.
No, I mean, it doesn't surprise me. And I have to say straight away, I mean, I've never thought myself that Iran was remotely a match for Israel. In fact, if I have to say this, the fact that Iran was able to continue to strike Israel with missiles for as long as it did during the conflict period actually surprised me. I mean, they demonstrated last year that they did have a missile capability that could reach Israel, but I was far from sure that they would be able to sustain it for any length of time. I think it's become absolutely clear that the Iranian air defense system is completely incapable of defeating Israel by itself. I think that the Iranian military altogether is almost certainly no match for Israel. And here we've got to talk about the fact that the Iranians themselves have made extraordinary mistakes. They were apparently at various times. I mean, Putin himself has said this, that they were offered help. The Russians offered them help to develop an air defense system. And they said, no, because our air defense missiles are better than your air defense missiles. They were apparently, Putin said this actually. So, I mean, there's no doubt about this, that they were apparently offered security agreements by the Russians, and they rejected them as well. It is very difficult to understand, actually, some of the decisions that Iran itself has been making. And I mean, I'm going to say this. I think I've been very critical of what the Americans have done over the JCPOA, but I'm going to be equally critical with the Iranians. And I've said this many times. What is the point of enriching uranium up to a level of 60% if you're not going to build nuclear weapons? They always say they're not going to build nuclear weapons. So why are they enriching uranium up to that level?
To strengthen the negotiating position with the US?
Well, we saw how that ended. It ended up with Iran being attacked. I mean, and it was given how the United States and Israel feel about Iran, there was a strong likelihood, a more than strong likelihood, that that would be the outcome. And so, I mean, I would have thought if you want to strengthen your negotiating position, stick with the terms of the JCPOA, develop closer economic ties with other countries like China and Russia, which are keen to trade with you. Perhaps even import weapons from those two countries or offering you those countries. And that puts you in a better position to negotiate with the Israelis and the Americans and all of those. But they didn't do any of these things. And I really don't understand much of the logic of this. It seems to me that Iran wants to persuade itself that it is some kind of Middle East superpower, when it obviously isn't. So, yes, I think they do have some capabilities. They are offensive capabilities. They have long-range missiles that can reach Israel and can maneuver to some extent. It can hit targets there. But ultimately, if there's an all-out war between themselves and Israel, then they need to understand that they're heavily outmatched.
Yeah, if Israel was able to wipe out half their missile launchers, I think it was about half, more, I think more than half, in 12 days. Imagine if the war goes on for 30 days. They wouldn't have any launchers left for their big missile stockpiles.
Well, that is what the Israelis say. The Iranians say otherwise. Who knows what the truth is? I don't know.
What do you think?
I don't know, because I don't believe what either side is saying. I mean, this is one thing I've learned from the Ukraine war. Never assume that anything that anybody says over the course of a war is necessarily true. But there is something else, and that is that it does seem that even as the Iranians were running into problems, may have been running into problems with launching their missiles, the Israelis, for their part, were running into problems with the numbers of their air defense missiles. Now, that creates all kinds of issues and problems. But do bear in mind something. Let's assume the best case scenario for Iran, that they can continue to strike Israel. Israel runs out of air defense missiles first, before Iran runs out of launchers and missiles itself, and the war continues and things become more difficult for Israel. Well, there's always the United States in the background. And if the United States isn't there, Israel has nuclear weapons and Iran does not. So, it, again, a lot about Iran's policies, foreign and defense policies, have never made a great deal of sense to me.
Hmm. What about Israel's audacity to strike Qatar?
Well,
What do you make of that?
well, I think that it was, in my opinion, absolutely the wrong thing to do. It was an infringement of the territorial integrity and the airspace of a sovereign country. It it attempted to kill people who were involved in a negotiation and discussing a ceasefire, and I suspect that it will have created some unhappiness within the Gulf states, but it's not going to change the overall dynamic of the conflict. It's not going to solve anything, and it's not going to make the situation in Gaza better. It's not going to ultimately change the dynamic of the whole situation in the Middle East.
What confuses me is first, there's been reports that the fighter jets fired over Saudi territory from
Yeah.
the I think it's the Red Sea. So for Saudi not to intercept those missiles, and for the US not to, whether to green light them or not, at least try to intercept them as well. Why would the US do that? And why would Saudi do that? Why would they treat one of their allies that hosts their biggest foreign military base, the biggest foreign military base for the US, treat it that way when the US is meant to offer security for that country?
Well, again, I don't know, and I think there's a number of things to say here. I mean, there is a view. I'm not saying that it's true, by the way, but there is a view, which I've seen in some places, that in fact they were all in it together. The Iraqis, sorry, the Saudis, the Americans, the
And the
Qataris,
Qatari.
and the Israelis. They were all in it together. That they intended to kill these people, and it just didn't quite work out that way. So when it failed, they all scrambled to make up their stories. So that is possible. It could also be the case that the Israelis conduct many airstrikes in many places. The Saudis might have thought it was an airstrike being prepared against Iran. They might not have realized that the target was Qatar. And it may be that the Saudis are relaxed about Israeli airstrikes against Iran and were taken aback by the fact that it was a strike against Qatar. You are probably more informed about this than I am, but there's also another view, which I've also heard, that Saudi Arabia and Qatar are not the best of friends, and sometimes
True.
the Saudis are not particularly sorry if things happen to the
Publicly,
Qataris.
the way it looks though now is that they've all publicly come together to condemn this.
Yes.
And what really perplexes me is it seems that the US, look, I understand what's happening in Ukraine. The US played a role, in my opinion, to cause the war with NATO's expansion. Obviously, it's heavily debated by many analysts, but that's how I see it. But what's happening in Gaza and what's happening in the Middle East just works so much against American interests. And you can expand towards the regime change in Libya, what happened, regime change in Syria, what happened, the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, but that's a much longer discussion. I'm just really perplexed at what the hell the US is doing there and how it's spreading itself so thin when China's continuing to quietly rise and rise. If the US is losing international support by playing a role in all these wars, Gaza being probably the most detrimental from an optics perspective for the US image globally, not gaining anything when it comes to the Middle East. Now, Ukraine, maybe they've over gambled and kind of they lost that gamble. They took a risk and their risk didn't pay off, and now they're stuck in that quagmire where they need to end the war, but they cannot let Ukraine completely lose. But I just don't understand the strategy in the Middle East. I don't understand what I'm missing.
Well, I think you're asking a question which many people are asking the same question. People in the United States have now started increasingly to ask that question, and there is a strong argument that one of the reasons why ultimately Donald Trump won the election last year was because many people in the United States are tired of all of these wars and all this involvement, especially in the Middle East, and they want it to end. And there are also people in the Pentagon, people like Elbridge Colby, who have been arguing consistently that the Middle East is a distraction, that the real conflict is with China in the Asia-Pacific region, that the United States is diverting resources which are becoming increasingly scarce, to the Middle East, and even more so to Ukraine. And so those arguments do exist. Now, here I think we have to talk about bureaucratic inertia, the fact that there is a massive long-term investment by the United States in the Middle East going all the way back to the 1960s, and which I remember, by the way. I remember when the United States started to involve itself heavily in the Arab-Israeli conflict, as we referred to it at that time. The United States at that time in the 60s was anxious to become involved in the Middle East because it believed, completely wrongly in my opinion, that if it didn't, the Soviet Union would somehow come in and would establish some kind of predominant influence there. And in the 60s, that was not perhaps quite such a fanciful idea as it appears today. So there has been a very long history of very intense involvement by the United States in the Middle East. There's been a very long history of a very strong relationship between the United States and Israel. People have grown up with it. Military people are trained in it. State Department officials are trained in it as well. It is very difficult to change. And of course, going beyond that, domestic politics in the United States has for many, many years now been organized around this also, with donors and finance and lobby groups and all of those things.
Alexander, I've been looking into APAC over the last couple of months as I hear more and more people, including people within the administration and people allied to Trump. The latest person I interviewed about this was Marjorie Taylor Greene, Congresswoman, and the more I dig into it, the more my questions increase. It's just a fascinating, complex web that is the U.S. democracy. It's a beautiful but severely imperfect system that I still believe in as a citizen of Australia, another democracy. But going back to China, which I think is the biggest threat right now to the U.S., it's undisputable. How far off is the Chinese military might to America's military might?
Well, this
in your opinion?
Right. This is a difficult question. I mean, bear in mind, I'm not a person with a military background, so I can only give you my own impression. My own view is that China is overwhelmingly strong in its immediate neighborhood, but that it lacks the global reach that the United States still has. And I suspect that the United States still has significant technological advantages. Now, I think those technological advantages are likely to erode, but I doubt that China anytime soon is going to match the United States in terms of global reach. I don't think the Chinese Navy, for all the fact that they're rolling out aircraft carriers, is ever going to have 11 aircraft carriers and these hundreds of bases around the world and an air force that can operate in every place pretty much simultaneously. So for the moment, and I think not just for a moment, but for a while, globally, the United States is significantly stronger. In China's immediate periphery, in the East and South China Seas, in the Straits of Taiwan, the balance is shifting.
Yeah. But also warfare is just changing so rapidly that weapons that were considered significantly impactful just a few years ago are now becoming potential, Achilles heels for the US, especially including all these massive warships. The last question I wanted to ask you, I had it written down here, is okay, yes. When you're going to the Venezuelan crisis, I knew there's something that we haven't even discussed that also happened in the last few days.
Yeah.
There is warship, American warship, near Venezuela now in the Caribbean, and a boat, apparently a drug trafficking boat for the cartels, was struck by the American military. What is this? Is that America's war? I think America did, and I've been following it closely, but they did designate the cartels as a terrorist organization. I think that was a pretext for what we're seeing right now. Is that just an attempt to implement the Monroe Doctrine and potentially lead to a regime change? I hate that word, but regime change in Venezuela, or is that simply the U.S. playing hard with drug trafficking?
Well, it's a very good question. I don't think it can possibly be just about drugs trafficking. I mean, one shouldn't underestimate the seriousness of this problem, which is a huge social problem in the United States as well. But I mean, you don't, it seems to me, deploy F-35 fighter jets, 3 Aegis class missile destroyers, an amphibious warship, and all of that to the seas around Venezuela, in order to simply destroy, speedboats that are carrying drugs, possibly to the United States. I mean, clearly, there is something more going on here than that. Now, these forces are very powerful and they are very impressive, but they are not sufficient in themselves to conduct, it seems to me, an armed invasion of Venezuela. I mean, I spoke about the Iranian military. I mean, the Venezuelan military is obviously no possible match for the United States, but Venezuela is a very big country. I mean, to invade a country with of that size, with the forces that the United States has available, the ground forces available, it's asking
There is
too
no way,
much.
but there's
There
no
is
way this is going to happen.
Yeah.
Trump will lose all his domestic support. Like he's meant to be the
Exactly.
peace president. Everyone's talking about him winning the Nobel Peace Prize. And now we're talking about a new war with Venezuela that no one was even talking about a few
Yes,
months ago.
exactly.
I doubt that, but it could be pressure
It could be.
to force Maduro to improve relations with to distance himself from China.
Well, I think probably, and from BRICS altogether, and to open up
Mm.
Venezuela to American oil companies, Chevron going back, taking over the oil industry there. Venezuela has enormous oil and gas reserves, as everybody knows. There are difficulties apparently refining Venezuelan oil because it is heavy, but the United States is very, very familiar with how to do that. And of course, if you are in conflict with the Russians, who are big oil producers, and you're worried about the situation in the Middle East, and you're thinking of tightening up controls on the global oil market, well, having a ready supply of oil from Venezuela might be a good thing. So I suspect it's something more to do with that than drugs cartels and
I agree.
outright invasions and anything of that kind.
I agree. Final question, Alexander, is everyone loves to fearmonger with World War III. We're on the brink of World War III. We cannot deny that we're getting closer and closer. But how close are we, in your opinion? And maybe you could give us like a scale of 1 to 10 and give us where were we a couple of years ago, prior to the invasion, during the invasion, after the Gaza war, and how things have progressed since, and especially under the Trump administration. Are we getting closer to 1, which is least likely for a nuclear World War III, not nuclear, for a World War III, or getting closer to a 10, which is obviously worst case scenario?
I would put us at about 3, which is dangerously high, given how dangerous how disastrous, cataclysmic World War III would be. I mean, I think before the start of the special military operation, we were at roughly 1, which is already actually high. I mean, you really want it to be as close to 0 as possible. But I think we've now moved significantly up. We are at 3. Now, there are ways back. There can be negotiations. And I have to say this, on balance, I'm confident that we're going to avoid this. I'm confident that nobody ultimately wants to be there. So there will be negotiations. There will be discussions. People will give ground to each other in order to avoid that. But we should never have let ourselves get to this point in the first place. And that is the big lesson we need to learn once the crisis in Ukraine is over. And we've also got to think about the situation in the Middle East and in the Far East as well, because obviously these risks, I mean, they should never be taken. We should never take risks with world peace.
Yeah, I just think like there's just so many scenarios that I would have considered close to impossible just a few years ago. Israel striking Qatar, the invasion of Ukraine that is ongoing to this day, and the geopolitical shift we're seeing toward, shifting towards China. These are all things that I would have,
Well,
just considered to be highly improbable.
I thought an Israeli strike on Qatar was I would have thought this would have been highly improbable. I would have completely dismissed
Yeah,
it.
that's been the most shocking to me. But
Just
surprisingly,
a
that's
week
the
ago.
most shocking thing in the last 2 years. Yeah,
Yeah.
that's the most shocking.
Yeah.
I was more shocked by that strike in Qatar. I've said this many times. Than the war in Iran. The war in Iran, we saw it boil over. I didn't
Absolutely.
expect us to get there. I didn't even expect to see a full-blown war with Hezbollah. I overestimated Hezbollah's capabilities and underestimated Israel's capabilities, but then they exceeded those expectations. But Qatar,
Yeah.
that was definitely not on the bingo card.
Absolutely.
But here we are.
Here we
I
are.
don't know what to expect anymore.
No.
But
No.
and I'm
that
sure.
and that is a dangerous situation. We need to get back to a world which is predictable and
Yes.
stable. Now that
Yes.
there will always be problems, but it's much easier and better to address problems in a predictable and stable global environment than when the situation is as dangerous and as fraught as it is today. And
Have you heard? Have you heard the reports? Just quickly, have you heard the reports that Israel was thinking about considering striking Hamas and I think it's Turkey or Egypt, and then they decided to strike them in Qatar because the risk was significantly less. I'm not sure if you've seen those reports, but imagine Israel striking targets in Turkey, and considering Erdogan's pride. Oh,
well, exactly. I mean, fortunately, that didn't happen. But after what has happened, how can we be sure that it won't happen? We can't be. And everybody, all the governments in the Middle East, will be now calculating and debating with each other what to do.
it changes it when you cross. The thing is, when you cross a red line, it changes everyone's mindset.
Correct.
When Russia invaded Ukraine, it changed the entire Baltic mindset, no matter what the reasoning was.
Yes.
When Israel struck Qatar, it changed the entire mindset in the Gulf countries. I'm sure they're all having a discussion behind the scenes saying, whoa, we didn't expect that to happen. It's like there's unwritten rules that, hey, we don't do that. And when you cross them, now we're in a whole different territory. And I feel like we're kind of slowly boiling a frog, slowly getting into that, getting closer and closer above that 3 out of 10 mark that you've given. But we've opened Overton's. We keep opening Overton's window time and time again, and it's just not a pleasant feeling to have.
No, it's a very dangerous feeling. And you're absolutely correct in all the things that you've just said, by the way. I mean, these taboos, these red lines exist for reasons. And the reckless way that we are crossing them all the time, when I say we, I mean everybody is crossing them all the time, is extraordinarily dangerous. And we really need to take a step back and stop. I had some hopes when Trump was elected that he would do that.
I think he's trying in Ukraine. I've genuinely seen him trying Ukraine, but it's just a lot more complicated than he expected.
Yes.
I'm just not sure about the Middle East.
Yes.
I don't understand that chemistry between Israel and the US. I'm just not able to make sense of it. I'm still trying, and I tend to be an optimist. So we'll see. And we'll see. Fingers crossed. But Alexander, absolute pleasure to speak to you, sir. Thank you so much for your time. Went way over time. It's been an incredible discussion.
Thank you very much. Thank you. And it's been a great pleasure for me too.